The past does not give up its secrets easily. Sometimes it offers them in a forgotten letter, a diary bound in leather, and sometimes, if you are very lucky, it holds them out to you in the hands of the dead. Before we get started, please subscribe and let me know in the comments where you are viewing from and what time you are listening to this narration. The locations and times of day or night that these verified stories reach are of interest to us. Dr. Elias Thorne had spent a quarter of a century breathing the unique atmosphere of the past. It was a tangible thing to him, a scent of aging paper, brittle leather, and the cool, sterile air that circulated through the climate-controlled vaults of the Claiborne Archive. As the senior archivist in the sprawling city of Port Providence, his world was a hushed sanctuary, a cathedral dedicated to memory. He was a man who believed that true history wasn't found in the grand pronouncements of kings and generals, but in the quiet, discarded artifacts left in their wake. A discarded train ticket, a love letter folded 100 times, the ghostly image captured on a fragile glass plate negative. His life's work was to listen to the whispers of these objects, to give voice to the silence. But in all his years, he had never heard a voice as clear and commanding as this one. The portrait arrived in a dusty cardboard box from an estate sale in the city's old industrial iron quarter. It was part of a larger, mostly unremarkable donation. Dozens of glass plate negatives, each carefully wrapped in the brittle yellowed pages of a 1928 newspaper whose headlines spoke of stock market anxieties and local politics. Elias had spent the better part of the morning sifting through them with the methodical reverence he reserved for such tasks, his gloved fingers moving with practiced delicacy. Most were exactly what he expected from the era, a predictable tableau of a bygone age. Stern-faced merchants posing stiffly before their storefronts, their pride warring with their discomfort, formal wedding parties frozen in a state of awkward joy, children in starchy Sunday clothes whose eyes betrayed a desperate universal wish to be anywhere else. He catalogued them with a quiet efficiency, each one a small, familiar piece of a puzzle he knew well, another note in a familiar song. And then he unwrapped the one that changed the melody entirely. It felt as though it pulled the very air from his lungs and silenced the ambient hum of the archive's climate control systems. 3 women stared back at him through the delicate emulsion, their gazes traversing more than a century to meet his with an unnerving, almost confrontational directness. A mother, perhaps in her early 40s, sat centered in an ornate dark wood chair, her posture radiating an unassailable poise that seemed carved from granite, a quiet defiance against the ravages of time and hardship. On either side of her, standing with a protective and elegant grace, were her daughters, who appeared to be in their late teens or early 20s. All 3 were African American, dressed in what was clearly their absolute finest. Their high-collared dresses were works of art, detailed with intricate lacework at the throat and cuffs that spoke of painstaking, loving craftsmanship. Their hair was swept up in a style of obvious care, framing faces that held a quiet, unyielding dignity. The formal studio backdrop, a painted English garden scene, was a common theatrical flourish of the time, meant to bestow a sense of pastoral respectability. But against the raw power of their presence, the backdrop seemed flimsy and insignificant. What held Elias motionless, what made the world outside this single fragile piece of glass dissolve, wasn't the masterful composition nor the subject's proud expressions. It was their hands. The mother's hands rested in her lap, but not in any posture of natural repose. They were arranged in a peculiar, meticulously choreographed pattern. Her fingers were interlaced in a way that was both strange and deliberate, a silent semaphore. Her right thumb was crossed firmly over her left, while her index and middle fingers were extended, held straight and parallel. The other fingers were curled inward, hidden from view. The daughters each placed one hand on their mother's shoulders, not just resting there for support, but positioned with an unmistakable intent. The daughter on the right mirrored her mother's gesture in miniature, her thumb and fingers creating a similar, though slightly different shape against the dark fabric of her mother's shoulder. The daughter on the left had her fingers arranged in yet another specific configuration. A subtle but distinct variation on the same silent theme. Elias lifted his archival magnifying glass, the cool, heavy brass a familiar weight in his palm. He had examined thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of Victorian-era portraits. He knew the photographers of that period were tyrants of stillness, demanding absolute rigidity from their subjects during the painfully long exposure times. A fidget, a cough, a simple blink could blur the plate and ruin the expensive effort. Every detail in these early photographs was, by sheer necessity, intentional. A relaxed, natural pose was the standard. These hands were anything but relaxed. They were a statement. They were a dialect. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it clean with the soft cloth he always kept in his pocket and looked again, his heart beginning to beat with the frantic, exhilarating rhythm of discovery. In the bottom right corner of the negative, so faint he had almost missed it, someone had etched a tiny, spidery series of characters into the glass with a fine point. PP-1891-73*. Elias couldn't shake the image from his mind. It followed him out of the archive and into the clamor of the modern city, a silent, ghostly passenger on the subway ride home. That evening, in his quiet apartment overlooking the gray expanse of the river, he spread his research materials across his heavy oak dining table like a general planning a campaign. He had photographed the glass negative with a high-resolution digital camera, and now the portrait filled his laptop screen in startling, luminous clarity. The three women seemed to inhabit his small apartment, their presence almost tangible, their collective gaze a challenge. He could see the fine woven texture of the wool in their dresses, the tiny seed pearl brooch pinned to the mother's collar, the subtle inherited curve of the daughters' mouths that spoke of their shared bloodline. But it was the hands that commanded him, that pulled him deeper into their mystery. He zoomed in until each finger, each knuckle filled the frame. This wasn't a casual gesture. The mother's thumb was crossed with a conscious muscle engagement required to hold it so steady. He pulled books from his shelves, texts on semiotics, on the history of African American fraternal orders, on the coded languages of oppressed peoples throughout history. He scanned pages on Masonic symbols, on West African Adinkra, on the visual cues of the temperance movement. He found nothing that matched. It was a language without a Rosetta Stone. The women in the photograph remained silent, their secret held tight. This was 1891. The Emancipation Proclamation was 28 years in the past, and the brief, hopeful chapter of Reconstruction had been brutally slammed shut over a decade earlier. This was the dawn of what historians called the nadir, a period of intense systemic oppression and violence against African Americans, where the promises of freedom were systematically dismantled by Jim Crow laws in the South and a more insidious bureaucratic racism in the North. What networks, operating in the heart of a supposedly progressive northern city like Port Providence, would still have needed such intricate secret codes? The question hung in the air of his quiet apartment. His phone buzzed, a sharp intrusion. It was a text from his colleague, Dr. Isabel Reyes, a brilliant historian from Northwood University whose work on the sociology of marginalized communities was groundbreaking. She possessed an academic rigor that perfectly complemented his own archivist's intuition. He had sent her a picture of the portrait an hour ago with a single loaded question. "Ever seen anything like this?" Her response was characteristically brief. "Free tomorrow, 9 a.m. at the Claiborne. My curiosity is piqued. What have you found?" Elias typed back, "Something that might rewrite what we know about post-Reconstruction survival in Port Providence. Bring everything you have on property rights and documentation struggles." Isabel Reyes arrived at the Claiborne archive at 9 o'clock sharp, a worn leather satchel slung over her shoulder and a thermos of coffee in her hand. Her expression was a familiar mix of academic curiosity and friendly skepticism. Elias had the portrait projected onto the main wall of the research room. The three women were rendered larger than life, their gazes seeming to appraise the modern, sterile space they now occupied with a quiet, knowing power. "All right, Elias," Isabel said, her eyes immediately drawn to the image, her skepticism visibly melting as she took in the full-scale image. She put her thermos down and walked closer. "You have my full attention." "Look at their hands," he said, using a laser pointer to trace the unnatural angles. "It's choreographed." Isabel's sharp historian's mind was already racing. "After Reconstruction collapsed," she began, her voice low and intense, "African-American families faced a different kind of war. It wasn't fought with guns, but with paper, with bureaucracy. Property rights, inheritance laws, even proof of one's own identity became weapons." She opened her satchel and spread a collection of documents across a large table. Brittle legal papers, copies of city records, newspaper clippings from the 1880s and 1890s. She picked one up. "Look at this," she said, her finger tapping the faded print. "The Harrison family. Lived in the Iron Quarter for 2 generations, ran a small bakery in 1888. A developer wanted their land for a new factory. Suddenly the city lost the original deed from the 1850s. The Harrisons had no other proof. Their word was deemed insufficient. They were evicted. Their house, their business, their entire lives torn down within a week. This happened over and over." She pushed another clipping towards him. "Or this, the Miller family. A father dies, leaving his small carpentry business to his son. But because he and his wife were married by a traveling black preacher years before and never filed the official city paperwork they were likely told they didn't need or couldn't get, the marriage was declared legally void. The son was ruled illegitimate and the business was seized by the state and sold. Systemic theft, all done with a pen and a stamp. Port Providence wasn't the progressive haven the city's brochures claim," Isabel continued, her voice sharp with indignation. "Black families were systematically stripped of their assets. Many had fled the South with nothing but their oral histories, no birth certificates, no marriage licenses. In the eyes of the city's legal system, they were ghosts. Their word, their history meant nothing." Elias's gaze drifted back to the three women on the wall, dignified, proud, and holding a secret that was their only shield against a world designed to erase them. "So they adapted," Isabel said, her tone shifting from anger to a quiet awe. "I've been researching the mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations from this period. The official records are sparse, but the oral histories are rich. They created their own networks. They pooled money for lawyers. They shared information. They created their own verification systems when the official ones were designed to exclude them." "Secret networks," Elias said quietly, the words feeling heavy and important. "Not secret in the sense of clandestine," Isabel corrected gently. "Secret in the sense of parallel. They were operating alongside the official systems using their own language, a language that white authorities either didn't notice or simply dismissed as unimportant tribal nonsense." Elias turned back to the portrait, the pieces clicking into place with an almost audible snap. "What if this isn't just a photograph?" he whispered. "What if it's a certificate, a deed, a passport for a world that refused to recognize them?" The etched code, *PP-1891-73, now felt like the key to everything. It became their singular focus. After 2 exhausting days hunched over dusty, spine-cracked city directories in the municipal archives, the air thick with the smell of decay, Elias found it. There, in a ledger from 1890 in faded brown ink, was the entry. Ash Theodore, photographer, Studio 73, 8th Avenue. Research into Theodore Ash himself revealed something extraordinary. He was a white man, born in rural Pennsylvania, a Quaker by upbringing who had trained as a photographer in Philadelphia. He moved to Port Providence in 1888 and established his studio in a neighborhood that was rapidly becoming one of the most diverse in the city. But it was Ash's clientele that was truly unusual. In an era when most white photographers either refused to photograph black clients or charged them exorbitant rates, Ash's advertisements appeared regularly in Port Providence's African-American newspaper, the Providence Beacon. His studio, his ads proclaimed, welcomes all customers at equal and fair rates, for all of God's children deserve to be seen. Isabel, digging through digitized newspaper archives, found a rare interview Ash gave to a small, progressive journal in 1894. In it, he spoke passionately about photography as a tool for the conferral of dignity and the preservation of truth, arguing that every person, regardless of station or background, deserves a quality portrait to mark their place in the world. Between the lines of his carefully chosen words, Elias sensed something more, a quiet, determined activism. It was a deliberate choice to use his craft and his social standing to serve a community that others actively excluded. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a co-conspirator in the fight for dignity. He was an ally, Isabel said, reading over Elias's shoulder, a crucial one. And if these hand positions are a code, he had to be in on it. He was the one documenting it, the one creating the physical evidence. He was as much a part of this network as anyone. They sat in the sacramental quiet of the archive, the image of the three women glowing on the wall before them, their secret now feeling less like a mystery and more like a fortress. They had a time, a place, and a key player. They had the historical context, a world of systemic oppression that made such a secret network not just plausible, but an act of profound necessity. But the central mystery remained, as silent and profound as the women's gazes. They knew who had captured the message, but they still didn't know what it truly meant. The language of the hands was still a lock, and they were still searching for the key. Of course, here is the second part of the story, continuing from where the first part left off and concluding the narrative. The problem of the code itself, the silent language held in the hands of the three women, led Elias to contact Dr. Samuel Aris, a brilliant cryptography historian at Northwood University. Sam was a whirlwind of intellectual energy, a man who saw history as a series of brilliant puzzles waiting to be solved. He arrived at the Claiborne archive that afternoon, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the projected image on the wall. He bypassed polite greetings, walking directly to the wall as if drawn by a magnetic force. "Victorian codes are my favorite," he said, his voice buzzing with excitement. "They're always ruthlessly practical. We look at them now and see complexity, but to the user, they were simple. The key is always context. Who needed to communicate? What precisely did they need to say? And most importantly, who were they hiding it from?" He spent the next hour photographing the hands from multiple angles, creating digital tracings on his laptop that isolated the gestures from the rich detail of the dresses and backdrop. He worked with a ferocious concentration, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he built models and tested theories. "Okay," he muttered, thinking aloud, a habit Elias found both irritating and fascinating. "It's not alphabetic. The repetition is structural, not phonetic. It's not a known sign language, either professional or regional. It's too static. The poses are held, not fluid. This is about status, not sentences." He worked for hours, his focus absolute. He cross-referenced the hand positions with symbols from West African traditions that might have survived the Middle Passage, with Masonic rituals, and with the visual lexicon of other fraternal orders of the era. Nothing was a direct match. It was as if he were trying to translate a language with no known relatives. Finally, late in the afternoon, he leaned back from his screen, a look of profound respect dawning on his face. "I was an idiot," he said, shaking his head. "I was looking for an existing language, but I think they created their own, using a combination of familiar elements to build something new. It's a visual syntax. The mother's hand is the primary signal, the root of the statement. Based on its position, its specific configuration, it could mean family head, landowner with clear title, or member of the network in good standing. The daughter's hands are the modifiers, the adjectives. Their positions could clarify the mother's status or add their own. Legally documented child, undocumented seeking assistance, or vouched for by community elder. It's a system of tiered verification, a silent, unforgeable letter of introduction. Someone trained these families how to pose, and someone else knew exactly how to read these images. While Sam had given them the grammar of the language, it was Isabel who found the dictionary. She spent days buried in the city's legal archives, her determination fueled by Sam's breakthrough. Late one night, surrounded by stacks of crumbling legal files, she found the name that would connect every thread: August Bell. Bell was a lawyer, an African-American man with an office on West Market Street, who had an astonishingly high success rate defending black families in property disputes during the 1890s. His name appeared again and again in cases that should have been unwinnable, and his primary evidence, submitted time and again to skeptical judges, was photographic portraits. In Bell's archived case files at the Port Providence Public Library, files no one had looked at in decades, Isabel found a box of his personal correspondence tucked inside a ledger. She found a letter dated March 1893 to a minister in the Iron Quarter. The paper was fragile, but the ink was clear and the voice was strong. It laid the entire conspiracy of hope bare. Our photographic documentation now includes over 70 families. Mr. Ash continues to provide his services at minimal cost, for which we are eternally grateful. His discretion and commitment are a blessing to our cause. The hand positioning system allows us to encode essential information regarding family status, land ownership, and community standing, which can be verified by our trusted associates at a later date. Each portrait serves as both a dignified representation of our people and a practical instrument of identification in a world that seeks to render us nameless. Elias felt a shiver run down his spine as he read the scanned letter on his screen. They built a parallel documentation system. When the official channels were weaponized against them, they created their own, Isabel added, her voice thick with emotion. And they hid it in plain sight. With the network structure revealed, Elias became obsessed with giving a name to the women who had started it all. The donor records led him to Clara Mae Thompson, the 78-year-old woman from the Iron Quarter. He called her, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and anxiety. She was initially skeptical, her voice wary of a stranger asking about her family's past. A past she had been taught was filled with pain and loss. But when Elias described the portrait in precise detail, the lace, the chair, the way they held their hands, her tone changed. A long, profound silence stretched across the line. "My great-grandmother," she whispered finally, the words catching in her throat. "That's Elspeth Moreau, the daughters. My grandmother Amara and her sister Lisette." She paused, her breath catching as a fragmented memory surfaced. My grandmother's hands. They were never still, always sewing or kneading bread or tending her garden. But when she was serious, when she was telling you something important, she'd clasp them on her lap just so. I never thought. Her voice trailed off, lost in a memory she never knew she had. Elspeth was born enslaved in South Carolina. Clara Mae continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of her ancestor. Came north after the war, she was a seamstress, the finest in the city, and she helped people. That's what my grandmother always said. Elspeth helped families with their paperwork, finding housing, connecting them with lawyers. She knew how to navigate every system. She knew who to trust. With Clara May's blessing and her fragmented family stories as a guide, they traced Elspeth Moreau's connections records from the Shiloh Baptist Church showed she served on the Ladies' Aid Society. The Society's meeting minutes, written in elegant looping script, revealed the final hidden layer. Next to entries detailing charity given to families, flour and coal for the Jackson family were the strange notations, the number and letter codes that matched Theodore Ash's photographic numbering system. "This is it," Isabel breathed, pointing from the ledger to the photo list. The church society, led by women like Elspeth, was the intake point. They were the community's heart, identifying families in need. Ash, the ally with the camera, created the documents. Bell, the lawyer, used them as a shield in court. It was a chain of quiet, brilliant resistance run by seamstresses, ministers, and a few brave allies who crossed the color line. 3 months later, they organized an exhibition at the Claiborne Archive, hidden in plain sight. 20 of Theodore Ash's portraits were displayed, each digitally restored to its former glory, each telling the story of the family and the network that supported them. Clara May Thompson attended the opening night with her daughter and granddaughter. 4 generations of Elspeth Moreau's descendants stood before the image that had started it all, tears streaming down their faces. They were not alone. Elias and Isabel had located descendants from 12 of the other portraits. An elderly man named Marcus Bell stood before the portrait of his great-grandfather, the lawyer August Bell. "I always heard he helped our people," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "I never knew the extent of it. I never knew he was part of something this organized, this beautiful." Another woman, a young history teacher named Aliyah, pointed to a portrait of a stern-faced man. "That's my great-great-uncle, Samuel Jenkins. He was a school teacher. My family has a story that he was arrested once for falsifying documents. The charges were mysteriously dropped. Looking at this now, I don't think the documents were false. I think he was helping people get the true documentation they deserved." The Port Providence Times covered the exhibition, and the story went national. Soon, historians from across the country were contacting Elias, sharing tantalizingly similar findings from their own regions. Whispers of parallel networks in other cities, all operating during the same period, all using subtle codes to protect their communities. The secret language of the hands was not unique to Port Providence. It was a strategy of survival. 6 months after his discovery, Elias stood in the archive's conservation lab, carefully handling the original glass plate negative of Elspeth and her daughters. In Elspeth Moreau's diary, a small leather-bound book donated by Clara May, he had found an entry dated July 12, 1891. "Had our portrait made today, Mr. Ash is a kind and understanding man. He knows what we are building. The girls were nervous, but I told them this picture will matter. It will speak for us when we cannot. Someday people will see what we did here." She had been right. The photograph had mattered. It had carried a message across a century, a testament to a community's refusal to be erased. Elias looked at the image, then down at his own hands. He thought of the profound responsibility of the archivist, not just to preserve objects, but to listen to them, to give voice to the silent. To see what was hidden in plain sight, Elspeth's hands had created a code. His hands, more than a century later, had helped to read it. The conversation, he realized, was still ongoing. It was a story of quiet justice, told not with shouts, but with the deliberate, graceful positioning of a mother's hands,